You have on your desk a huge packet, right? A enormous packet. It's 13 front and back pages or something like that. Crazy. And if you have any extra credit or any assignments at all to turn in, I'll take them. We're going to go through all 13 pages today. No. This is everything. Yeah, please. This is the entire packet for the rest of this unit. This is everything through next Friday, I think. Now, first of all, you might say, Mr. David, you wasted my paper. Well, yes, I do. I don't think it's a waste because it helps you study, etc., right? But it's not any more than I usually would. Usually I would just give you one a day, and when you add it up, it would be that. So I thought, oh, why not just do this? And so you have the whole thing. Now, what this means is that you've got to be college prep students about it, which means you have to keep it, preferably not all wrinkled and rumpled, etc. How many of you have a nice filing system in your book bag that will keep things from being wrinkled and rumpled? Okay, thank you. Please make sure. And if you can show me at the end, when we get to the last thing, that you have it all done, that you kept it, I haven't had to give you extras, right? I might be willing to give you extra credit. Imagine that. Extra credit for doing something you should do anyway. Okay, so just letting you know. Okay, so what we're doing is populism and progressivism. The test is on November 9th. Here we have progressivism. We haven't talked about it yet. We're getting into it. If you look at this might look like a whole bunch of terms, and it is a whole lot of terms, but these are the terms we're going to go over today. I know that there's different ways people like to learn. Some people like to learn the small details. They like all the facts, like maybe two of you, maybe, right? So, like, here's where we're going with this. But if you want big picture stuff, I've got like an entire page of big picture stuff. Now, at the very top of this, there are two blanks, and I don't have it up here. It should say, explain the goals and successes of the late 19th century populist and progressive movement. So, goals and successes, very top goals and successes. Let's review what the populist movement was all about. This is big picture stuff, not all the details. Yesterday was the details, today is big picture stuff. So big picture stuff. The location of the reformers. What part of the country are we talking about? Where are these people from? There were many Southern populists. Now, I don't talk about them much because the Southern populists unfortunately had a lot of racism in their midst, and so they did not include African Americans into their movement, and that's one of the reasons why I think it died in the South, that populism didn't succeed in the South. If they had included African Americans, not only would it have been, the right thing to do, but it also would have helped their movement because there would have been more people. I don't talk about the South very much, though. Where's the main place I talk about? Right, yeah, and I just call that the Western, right? And we also need to remember that these are rural folk, farmers. The social group that we're talking about are mostly lower class people. There are middle class leaders of the populist movement that will be the ones who will run for public office, the reformers, but mostly we're talking about lower class folks. The education level, therefore, is low. These are not, the average populace is not going to college. They're not getting trained, above high school, if even that. You're going to see right next to that part of the chart is the progressives, and you're going to see that there's a lot of contrast between the populists and progressives in this top part. Now, this is where there's some similarities. The big overall goal of the populists was to look at industrialization, to look at the problems caused by industrialization, and then try to fix the problems of industrialization. That was their goal, and we talked about a lot of different ways that they tried to do that. So what was the main business that they wanted to reform? Railroads. Railroad reform, ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, Granger laws, those kind of things. What was their main money reform? Yeah. That was one of them. Yes, I did. I wasn't going to say that, but that's good. Income tax and bimetallism. So I just put generically money reform here. That's another way to fix the problems of industrialization. And then, just in general, laws to protect farmers, protect them from the grain elevators, to give direct election of U.S. senators so they can choose who they want to go to the Senate. Those kind of things. Hopefully, this is a review. You'll see that there are some similarities down here with the progressives as we get to the next page. Everybody good? All right. So, when we compare the populists to the progressives are the people who take up the reform mantle after the populists die out. Progressives are urban. The average progressive reformer you're going to find in big city. Can you see over there? If you want to move up, you can. They're urban. The social group of the average progressive reformer is middle class. Most of the reformers that come from the progressive movement are not lower class, and most of them are not upper class, because let's be honest, how much incentive does a rich person have to reform the system? Whatever the system is, it's benefited them, right? They're rich, they're wealthy, so they don't need to reform. And lower class people don't have the time because they're working all the time. They might have the motivation, but not the time. The middle class has a little bit of time and a little bit of wealth, and so they're the ones who are doing the reforming. The education level of these progressives are often college-educated folk. You know that when you drop your cap while I'm recording, they'll hear it on there for the rest of eternity, because I'll probably keep this forever. Just so you know, that was Halle Harris. Drop your chapstick cap. Okay. Now, look at the symbol. These are different. If you just look at the next thing that's very different, right? Here's the similarity. In fact, if you don't want to write all that out, you can just draw an arrow from what a populist was, right? They want to cure the problems of industrialization too. That's their main goal. They just go about it in a little bit of a different way. The main goal of many progressives was, let's return the power of government back to the people. Let's take away the power of government from political machines like Boss Tweed. Let's take away the power of government from big businesses, and let's return it to the people. And in that sense, there's a lot of similarities to the progressives, or to the populists. They want to restore economic opportunity for the lower classes. But this can be a country where you can come here and you can achieve the American dream, not be stuck in a slum working in deplorable conditions at a factory. And in that sense, there is a little bit of similarity with the populists. Now, this is one area where I think there's another divergence. There's another difference. The progressives focused more on social injustice and correcting social injustice. They want social justice. And you don't get that a lot from the populists. What do I mean by social justice? What is social justice? This is a buzzword that's been going around a lot lately, so you might have heard of it. Yeah? Like how people treat other races. That's one. Now, unfortunately, the progressives will not really reach a hand out to African Americans either. There's a lot of racism inside of them. We'll see that Woodrow Wilson, a progressive president, was told racist jokes in his cabinet meeting. Right? Introduced segregation to Washington, D.C. There is that. But if we're looking at immigrants and urban poor, then yes, accepting of those cultures and trying to give them a fair shake. Okay, now some more big picture stuff. The progressives were successful where the populists failed. The progressives were successful where the populists failed. Now, I'm not saying that the progressives got bimetallism. I'm not saying that, but they did get money reform, and we'll find out when we get to Woodrow Wilson. And progressivism is such an extremely wide-ranging movement that it's not like I can tell you this is what progressivism is, because I can tell you what populism is. It's farmers wanting to reform the way railroads and government treated them, right? But progressivism is not something I can just fit into a nice little box, because we're going to talk about them giving women the right to vote, which is awesome. We're also going to talk about them wanting to get rid of alcohol. What do those two things have in common, right? Environmental protections. Teddy Roosevelt will protect more land out west than I think any president ever. What's that have to do with those other two? And then, like, money reform, like if you take out a dollar bill, it'll have on it Federal Reserve at the top. Like that's another reform. Like what's that have to do with all of those things, right? And it's just like it's just a strange mix of, and it's just hard to pin down to what it actually is because there's so many types of reforms. So let me try to boil it down for you as best I can. This reform always started at the local level, and they got success. And so the success led them to the state level, and they got success. And so that led them to the national level, and they got success. In fact, we'll talk about at least two progressive presidents. We might argue that there was a third. And so the success breeds more success at higher levels. There'll be an election where every single candidate, there'll be four major candidates, and they will all say, we are progressive presidential candidates. Now, in addition, there are other themes, other ways of looking at it, how we can boil this down. There is promoting social welfare, which if you don't know what that means, is keeping people healthy and keeping them safe. It's keeping their physical bodies safe, keeping their physical bodies healthy. So that what you consume, what you eat, is what is actually, it says on the label. There's no secret ingredient that's going to make you sick. And yes, that was something that had to be addressed. We'll get to that with Teddy Roosevelt. When you go outside, there's not disease-causing muck and filth. There's not all this pollution that's going to fill your lungs and kill you, that kind of stuff. Not to mention helping people who are impoverished. But there's also a strong, almost Puritan strand in this, where some progressives look around the country and say, there's some moral wrongs, moral choices that people make that are wrong. Getting rid of alcohol is one. We call it prohibition. Some of the first anti-drug laws come during the progressive era early on. It's called the Narcotics Act. Anti-prostitution laws, anti-gambling movements, just think of any vices. Anti-that. Right? There's also economic reform they want to create, government reform, and we'll talk about efficiency in all of these areas. We'll talk a little bit about that today, here and there. And maybe another way to look at this is the progressive era. Are they more about social justice or social control? Are they more about freeing people and giving people rights and liberating people from oppression, or are they more about controlling people's behavior and actions? Because a settlement house can help an immigrant learn English, but what you're doing is you're trying to control their behavior to make them more American. Right? So which is it? That's just an example. Okay, now that's big picture stuff. I need to give you some individual terms so you can, see the examples, because if I was to give you a printout, and I didn't give you that printout in this huge package, if I was to give you a printout of the content statement 13 of the progressive era, you would see more individual facts and terms and names and policies than any other of these. And that's why this is basically its own test. Usually I have 3 or 4 content statements on the test. There's only one here because it's a lot. So here we go. Some of the first reform, especially for inner cities in urban areas, was seen in the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association. It was a religious organization. It started out in Germany, it kind of spreads to England, and then it comes to the U.S. If you don't believe me, you can go to our local Y, and they have a timeline. Have you seen it? Have you gone to the Y and seen the time on the Y? Y's walls, you're going back towards the weight room and the gym. Nobody has a YMCA membership. I don't blame you because COVID and all that. Who wants people redo on COVID breath? Anyway, the YMCA was not started as a place to work out. It was started as a place to, yes, have some physical activity, but also libraries for people to read, education for little kids, even housing in emergency situations where people could get food and shelter and a shower and those kind of things. You ever heard the YMCA song? For those of you who are listening on the internet, I just did the YMCA motions. Do it looking. Get your blood flow. Why? Nothing to participate. Okay, that's fine. What was my point here? There's a point. The song says you can get yourself clean, you can have a good meal, right? That's the kind of stuff that they're talking about. In addition to that, there's another thing that is still around today that started during this time period that went to help urban areas, and that was the Salvation Army. Now, Salvation Army, that should make you think of a religious movement. What religion am I talking about here that has to do with salvation? Christianity. These are both Christian things. Both of their goals is to get into inner cities and help out the urban poor. Immigrants, native, foreign Americans, right? And the Salvation Army has this unique way of doing it. See this right here? They would attract people by playing the popular music of the day. Now, back then, the popular music of the day in the late 1800s was like the John Philip Sousa band music. They would attract people there, and then they would give them food, and then they tell them about Jesus, right? And it was just a way to attract them. And that's just, churches do this all the time today, right? They set a pattern. Instead of playing big band music, they play rock music downtown to get people to come and feed them and then talk about Jesus. And so these groups here were trying to address the problems of the inner city poor using their faith to do so, and it's pretty successful. Those are still around today. Now, we've talked about this movement, the social gospel movement, and also its attachment movement, the settlement house movement. You might remember Jane Addams and Hull House, her settlement house. If I was to show you pictures of it, you'd see a gymnasium, and you see this huge library. You see this little daycare center, not little, big daycare center, a place where you could perform plays and musicals, a place to sleep and eat. They would provide you insurance, etc. This is all to help out the immigrant and the urban poor. And you might remember her name from when we talked about her the same day we talked about political machines. But she wasn't the only settlement house worker. Lillian Wald, and it wasn't just in Chicago where Hull House was. Lillian Wald was the founder of the Henry Street Settlement House, and that was in New York City. Not just Hull House in Chicago, it's also here. And there was one person in this lecture that I'm going to give you that actually reached out to African Americans. Her name was Janie Porter Barrett. She had a settlement house in Hampton, Virginia, and this was specifically to help African Americans out in that area. One of the few progressives who will reach out to racial minorities. But it wasn't just about providing people a nice place to stay and to learn English and job skills and all that. Also, these women, I just want you all to know that little drop pencil, that was Jacob Chester. How did you like my wife talking today? Was that a nice change up? Was it distracting to have the kids in there? A little bit. My wife gets today, so. Anyway. They also wanted to help clean up the cities. And we talked about that guy, that the White Ducks, Colonel Waring, that had those guys in white clean up the cities, sweep the trash. Well, these women were not just sweeping, they were also collecting trash on a regular basis. And they were very efficient at it. They divided the city up into sections, and they would have one group of people over each section. And by the time they were done setting up this system, the trash collection was much more efficient, and it decreased diseases like cholera and typhoid and tuberculosis and those kind of things. That is Jane Addams. She started this whole movement, and she later got a Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts. Okay. Now, all of these things I just talked about, social gospel, YMCA, Salvation Army, were very Christian in their orientation. They're very Christian in their focus. There is a change in how people think about religion and how some people think about religion during this time period. And I'm not trying to take you to Sunday school right now, I promise. I'm going to connect this to the history that we're looking at here. But does anybody know what the term original sin means? Yeah?
Either eating the apple,
Right, so you had that's why I have this picture here, right? Good. Adam and Eve. Here's an apple. It might have been a pomegranate. We don't really know. The Bible just says the fruit. And there's all this fruit. And actually, who's that? The snake, Satan, right? The Bible doesn't say it's Satan. The Bible says the serpent. That's what it says, literally. In Genesis. Maybe later on people say that, but in the book of Genesis, it's talked about that's the serpent. Anyway, you remember the story, right? Eve sees the fruit. She thinks it's attracted to Eve, but God had told them, this is the one rule: you don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She took it. The serpent was tempting her with it, and she ate it, and then she gave Adam, who was there with her, and he ate it. And sin entered the world, right? Now that was the original sin, but there's more to original sin than that. Does anybody know what there's more to original sin? Yeah. Oh, there's 7 deadly sins. Yes. Not necessarily what I'm talking about here. Original sin also means we all inherited that original sin from Adam and Eve. We were born with sin in us. Like we were born evil. That's what this particular version of Christianity talks about. And a lot of people believe this ever since the Middle Ages, right? That the reason why there's pain and suffering in the world is because there's evil inside of here. And the evil inside of here makes us do the bad out here. Right? And these reformers that I just talked about, they're not saying that. They're not saying that evil comes from here. They're saying that evil comes from here. And those of you who are not being able to see me on the video, I'm talking about evil comes from the environment. And does this make sense? Just follow this line of thinking. I'm not saying you have to agree with it. I'm not saying you have to agree with any of this. But if you follow this line of thinking with me, if a person is born into a household where the dad's a drunk and the mom sells her body for money and the kids are neglected and abused, is it any wonder that those kids grow up to be criminals and to do the same things that their parents did? Does that make sense? Right? And these people say that's not because the little kid was bad. They didn't want to be a prostitute when they were young. They didn't want to be a drunkard when they were young. They wanted to be astronauts. Kids want to be astronauts and firemen, policemen, right? And it was the environment that made them mad. And that's what these people are saying. Like, the reason why there's evil in the world is because of the environment around us. That's what makes us do bad things. We're taught to do that. And so does this make sense? Therefore, the solution is, if you make this out here better, then you make the person better. If you clean up the city and there's not as much alcohol, and there's not as much prostitution, there's not as much drugs, there's not as much crime and poverty, then there won't be bad people anymore. That's what they're arguing. And I think that even went beyond religion, because people started saying, yes, the key, the goal of our movement is to make this outside world better so that the person can be better. Now, you don't have to take a stance on that. Honestly, I would argue that it's probably a healthy balance of both, because there are people who do bad things because there's something in here, right? It's not just this out here. I mean, are we going to give Adolf Hitler a pass because he had a bad childhood? Right? I mean, there was something in here that was making there was other people who had bad childhoods like Adolf Hitler, and they didn't turn out like Adolf Hitler, right? But the goal here is of the progressive movement. Let's try to fix the environment, and that will make the person better. And so there's this group of people called the muckrakers. They're journalists. And what they do is they don't just look at like this ancient religious theory and they don't look at this like ancient law theory and write about that. They actually go out and they do research and they study scientifically and they find the problems in society and then they write about it and they expose the bad stuff in society to the light of day so that everybody can know what is actually the problem going on. And they were called muckrakers. Now, the term muckraker comes from probably the second bestseller of all time. The first bestseller of all time, best-selling book of all time is the Bible. The second best-selling book of all time you probably never heard of. Pilgrim's Progress. Yes, no. It's probably sold more copies than Harry Potter, even though whatever, right? Pilgrim's Progress was this allegory about this guy named Pilgrim, and he was on a journey from where he started to heaven, and all along the way, everything's symbolic and so on and so forth. And in his story, he sees these people in their life. Their head is always down and looking at the muck and the mire, and they're raking it up. And when these people come along, they take on that name because that's what they're doing. They're getting into the dirt and they're finding all this trash in society, this gross part, this corruption in society, and they're shining a light on it. They're raking it up. They're trying to clean it up. So some examples then would be somebody that we've kind of talked about already. You might remember him, you might not. Tomorrow we're going to have a video about him. His name is Jacob Riis, and he wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. The other half being the poor of society. And he went around, you can see this is one of the covers of the old book. He went around to these tenement houses, these packed, cramped apartments, and he took pictures of these tenements and he showed, especially the middle and upper class of New York City, what it was actually like to live in these tenements. And that got people talking and money raised and government changed so that there were reform laws written so that the tenements wouldn't be so gross. He shined a light on this one part of society that needs to be exposed, and he got some change. There's another person named Ida Tarbell. This is a female muckraker. And her book is called The History of the Standard Oil Company. You can see here on the cover of the book, she is depicting, who is she depicting? If she's studying the Standard Oil Company, what family is she studying? Rockefeller, very good. And she's depicting Rockefeller as this bloated, overfed, muddy rubber. And he is ruthless and he's cutthroat. And their family is just is a stain on society. And there needs to be more than just this Sherman Antitrust Act. We've got to have more. Oh, and there's a lot of trust busting that goes on in the early 1900s because of people like Ida Tarbell. There's Lincoln Steffens, who wrote The Shame of the Cities. And in his book, he's specifically targeting political machines. They're not just political machines in New York City with Boss Tweed. There's also political machines in Philadelphia. That's where he's targeting. Expose them to the light of day so that their deeds can be found out so that we can get rid of them. This next one might be my favorite. And there are some students every now and then who have read The Jungle. This is a fiction book. It is not, it's not nonfiction. It didn't really happen. But what Upton Sinclair did when he wrote The Jungle is he did a lot of research into the Chicago meat packing factories. And boy, he found a lot of nasty stuff. And so he wrote this novel about it. And it was gross. I mean, it was actually a meat packing industry in Chicago. It was nasty. I mean, have you ever seen, first of all, animals being slaughtered for eating? Pigs and cows and so on. You ever seen how the sausage gets made? It's gross. If you've seen it, it's gross. I've helped out with pig butchering before. And you first you take the animal and you shoot it in the head with a gun, right? So that and then you cut its throat, so all the blood is coming out, and then you open it up and you take out the entrails, and there's all these juices, and it's a nasty, gross kind of thing, and that's how you get your pork and how you get your beef and your chicken, right? And I'm turning some of you vegetarian. Okay, so in any case, that in and of itself is gross, but then in these meatpacking plants, first of all, they're dirty, nasty, filthy conditions. So just imagine all that dust and stuff that comes up from the ground and people coughing on the cow hocks that are hanging there, right? And then you take it and you put it in these big vats and you churn it up with these big blades and these ginormous vats. And you kind of want to make sure that it doesn't go bad, and so you might put some bleach in there. Did you know that there's an acceptable amount of bleach that you're allowed to have in your food? Oh, right? Yuck. And let's just say that at night sometime the janitor's sweeping up after everybody's gone home. He's got this big pile of dead rats and dirt, vomit. What are you going to do with all that stuff after you sweep it up? Carry it all the way down to the dumpster? There's a vat right there. Nobody will ever know because they just churn it up. Go in there, right? Ew. And sometimes when those big things are churning and maybe something gets stuck, or a guy puts his hand in there to try to dislodge it, and his finger gets cut off, and so instead of hamburger, you got a finger burger. Right? And I'm trying to describe how gross this is because that's the kind of stuff, and not to mention how overworked these people were, right? So, we haven't got to it yet, the Spanish-American War. In the Spanish-American War, there were more soldiers killed by rotten, putrid, awful meat than there were people who were actually fighting the Spanish and died. Right? That's how gross the meatpacking industry was. There was this nursery rhyme kind of thing. Mary Had a Little Lamb, the old nursery rhyme, the old song. They changed it during this time. Mary had a little lamb, and when she saw it sicken, it got sick and gross and nasty, not worthy of being eaten. She shipped it off to packing town, Chicago, and now they called it chicken. Yuck, right? Outside of Chicago, some of the rivers where all these juices and blood and entrails and chemicals were being dumped into the river. They called it Bubbly Creek because it didn't froth because of the water running. It frothed because of all the chemicals and blood juices. And just imagine all that crap. And kids are playing in this. And people are drinking out of this, right? I mean, Upton Sinclair's book, Teddy Roosevelt read it. And he's like, we've got to fix this problem. When he became president, he said, we got to fix this problem. Then we'll get to Teddy Roosevelt later. There were other muckrakers. I don't have time to tell you all of them, but one magazine specifically was Muckrakers. McClure's magazine was a muckraking magazine. Teddy Roosevelt himself actually got a start as a New York City councilman. And in it, he read Jacob Riis's book. And when he was on the New York City Council, he said, we've got to get tenement house reform. And that's where it started. He got the tenement house reform. There was a mayor of Cleveland, and he was a socialist. Not a socialist. I know a lot of people are afraid of socialism today. They might have a good reason, but this guy was pretty fair and pretty open and pretty honest. And what he wanted, instead of having behind closed door meetings where people, bribed the city officials, where the political bosses told everybody what to do, he would have large open public meetings where everybody could come and they could listen to what the actual city government is doing, and then they could voice their concerns. You can go today, and because of stuff like this, you can go today to Circleville City Council, and you can say anything you want, and you can listen to their business. It's happening. Do you know what we're doing right now? You can go and see these things. There's a city council meeting just the other day. You know how traffic gets backed up when there's a train that comes through town? They're going to maybe put an overpass there so that we don't have to stop, right? You can go and hear this kind of stuff, and this starts in the progressive era, so that people can actually have honest, non-corrupt people in office. Tom Johnson is a great example of this in Cleveland. We have commissioners today, county commissioners. They're in charge of the business of the county. And this system of having commissioners in counties starts when a hurricane hit Galveston, Texas in 1900. They hired city commissioners to come in and rebuild. You know, when there's a catastrophe like that, like an earthquake or a hurricane, there's all this money that comes in from the Red Cross and the government and so on. And if it's a political machine doing it, then they'll just skim some money off the top, put it in their pockets, and then use the rest to help the city. But no, the city commissioners here were scientifically trained in government efficiency and got the money to go where it needed to go, and people kept using this, and that's why we have commissioners today. And in Dayton, Ohio, there was a flood in 1913, and it was very devastating. And instead of having a corrupt mayor do all of the money handling, who might put some in his pocket and might give some to the political boss, instead they hired a city manager who was a person who had a degree from college in how to run government. And they got Dayton cleaned up pretty well, considering the devastating flood. And even today, we're trying to use city managers. Like Circle Village tried several times to get city managers on the ballot. There's another attempt coming up soon. So it's not a mayor anymore; it's a city manager. And Dayton flood was absolutely devastating. Gas lines, breaking caused fires, etc. There's this dude named Henry George, and he ran for New York City mayor. And his idea was, let's tax land. And if we tax land, if we tax rich people, then the rich people won't want to have so much land, and they'll sell it. And then we'll use that land that we buy to help give housing to poor people. We'll take away some of the power of the rich. We'll give the poor people some nice places to live. His ideas were socialist, and so he did not win the New York City mayor race, but people in academic circles liked this a lot, and they went with it. And today we have a lot of people who think, we got to tax the rich when they die. We got to tax the rich on their wealth higher, etc. And then finally, in business, there's this man named Frederick Taylor, and he said, we are wasting too much effort and motion in factories. And so what we need to do is find out a better way than instead of having people lift these heavy objects and breaking their back and wasting all this motion, let's have the stuff come to them. We call this the assembly line. He perfected this. Taylorism, scientific management by Frederick Taylor was awesome. If you're listening, get this, you all can go, but if you're listening, get this, waste less motion, get more work done. And you know who perfected this? Henry Ford, giving people the first $5 day because he was so efficient at it. And you can see all these people lining up to get jobs because they needed Henry Ford to pay them. And that's for you people at home. You can get this later if you want.